Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Samuels. I direct the Center for International Studies here at MIT and teach in the Political Science Department. I apologize that we're getting started a bit late this afternoon, but there was a class here that and we needed to make the changes, make the arrangements. The Center for International Studies, like the Institute as a whole, is celebrating an anniversary this year. It was founded 60 years ago to promote research and education in world affairs, and it continues to be home to a great many innovative programs, including the MIT Science and Technology Initiatives, known as MISTI, as well as the Security Studies Program and others. And I hope you'll pick up some of our materials on your way out, or if you haven't already done so. Another part of the center is the Robert E. Wilhelm Fellowship Program. And in that program, we attract global practitioners to spend time with MIT students and MIT faculty here on campus, very much in the mens et manus tradition of MIT. Previous Wilhelm Fellows have included the Deputy Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, the former Foreign Minister of Sudan, and the former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen. And today I'm especially pleased to introduce to you our current Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow in Residence at the Center for International Studies, the Right Honorable David Miliband, MP. David has been a member of Parliament since 2001, and between 2007 and 2010 to last year was the Foreign Secretary, the British Foreign Secretary. We're especially proud that he's an alumnus of the Political Science Department at MIT, where he took a master's degree while he was a Kennedy Fellow. And as some of you will recall, last year he was the Distinguished Compton Lecturer here at MIT, back at his alma mater. Now, his interests are exceptionally wide-ranging, and today he's volunteered to offer to us his analysis and his prescription for mending, not ending, the war in Afghanistan. So I give you David Miliband.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Dick. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today. It's a great honor to be back at MIT as a, not exactly a professor, but at least a lecturer, which is one step closer, I guess. And I'm very grateful to the Wilhelm family and the Wilhelm Fellowships for making this visit possible. I hadn't quite realized the significance of this year in the history of MIT, and to be able to share with you the 150th birthday celebrations of an institution that taught me a lot is a real extra privilege. The CIS has provided me with a really stimulating home for the last 3 days, and we've got 2 more days of meetings with graduate students. I'm even being unleashed on an undergraduate class tomorrow, although I've been assured that it's a question and answer session, not a lecture or anything quite so formal. But the CIS, I think, makes its name for tackling some of the hardest issues, and it's in that spirit that I want to offer some reflections today. I think that by any account, this is a remarkable time to be discussing foreign policy. We're living through what I think is probably the most intensive period of global integration and interdependence that the world has ever known. Economic power is obviously shifting from west to east, and the foreign policy consequences of that aren't yet known. Political power structures are being challenged by new ways for individual citizens to communicate and connect with each other. And as we can see from the extraordinary events in the Middle East and North Africa, the action is exciting, unpredictable, and the results are unknown. However, today I'm going to forswear the excitements of the Middle East and North Africa and talk about a conflict that is old, tiring, brutal, and expensive. And I do so because I fear that the war in Afghanistan is being waged by over 100,000 Americans, 10,000 British troops, 1,000 American diplomats, 150, 180 British diplomats, large numbers of American aid workers, a significant number of British aid workers from NGOs who are remarkably brave. I fear that the war in Afghanistan will once again, in the wake of these excitements elsewhere, become the forgotten war. That wouldn't be the first time that Afghanistan had become the forgotten war, because after 2002, it became the forgotten war with quite dangerous consequences. This is the case that I want to set out to you in the lecture today. That we, the West, have effectively announced an end date for the war, 2014. But we have not put in place the strategy for political negotiations actually to end the war. And the longer we wait, the weaker will be our leverage and our position, threatening both the substantive long-term interests that we have in Afghanistan and the final narrative of the Afghan drama that began on 9/11. So we urgently need to set out our view not just of the end date, but of the end game. And we need to set out a process to get there. And in this lecture, I'm going to set out my ideas both for the end game and the process to bring it about. I think that it's fair to say that the last few weeks have seen tentative signs of a welcome change in policy. Secretary Clinton spoke in an important speech to the Asia Society in February of a quote-unquote political surge. The New Yorker has reported that secret direct talks between the US and the Taliban have already started. NATO senior civilian representative Mark Sedwell, who's just retiring this week from his post, said last month, quote, "The time is now right to take the risk and pursue the political agenda with the same energy we have brought the military and civilian surges." And the deeply impressive Brahimi-Pickering report. Lakhdar Brahimi was the convener of the Bonn process in 2001-2. Thomas Pickering, a very distinguished American diplomat. Their deeply impressive report concluded, quote, "The best moment to start a political process toward reconciliation is now." But these deviations from the otherwise relentless focus on military operations, Allied and Afghan, need, in my view, to be taken to a whole new level of urgency, coherence, and effort if they're to get any purchase at all on the situation on the ground. At the moment, I would say these statements are eddies in the tide, and they need instead to become the tide itself. My purpose in this lecture is to try to rally maximum support behind that cause. Those of you who follow these things closely will know that a year ago I spoke here at MIT and made the most explicit set of proposals from any foreign government for how to end the war in Afghanistan through political negotiations. I said that foreign troops and aid workers were making a difference, but I argued that their efforts would ultimately be for naught, unsustainable, if they were not directed towards the achievement of a political settlement or series of political settlements across the villages and valleys of Afghanistan. And the political settlement that I advocated had two aspects. The first was internal, involving all those willing to participate, whatever their position on the political spectrum. I said that while it was reasonable for there to be conditions for the conclusion of political talks, notably the need to keep al-Qaeda out, I argued that there should be no preconditions for entry to the talks. I also said that for an internal political settlement to work, it needed to be supported by an external, regional political settlement, involving all the neighbouring countries. I concluded that unless a political settlement was actively pursued, it will become harder and harder to bring the war to an end. 1 year on, I returned to my case with more urgency and with more detail, because the case for a political strategy to match the military tactics that are being pursued with extraordinary bravery and patience by foreign troops and by Afghans is stronger and more urgent than ever. Think about it this way. In 2010, a year ago, the war seemed to many people endless because no one was talking about how to end it. A year on, NATO has pledged to transfer security leadership to Afghan forces by 2014. Media shorthand has presented 2014 as a date for the end of the war. For example, even the BBC its report on the Lisbon NATO summit last year had a simple headline: Karzai and NATO agree Afghanistan exit strategy. Would that it were so simple. In truth, some countries have been categorical that they will be out of Afghanistan completely. Others, like the US, have kept their options open, at least in the small print. While still others, like the UK, have both said that they will definitely be out, according to a fixed calendar, in our case 2015, and that conditions on the ground will be determinant, while also leaving unclear whether withdrawal is only about combat troops or includes training support. Now, the establishment of this timetable, however caveated for those of us who look at it carefully, shared by ISAF and the Afghan government, has had a calming or susurrating effect on the politics of the Afghan war, as if announcing an end date is the same thing as bringing a war to an end. General Petraeus' recent hearings on Capitol Hill were not just sparsely attended, they were also sparsely covered in the US and international media. And while there's been a lot of discussion about dates, and if you read the memoirs that are already coming out, some feuds about them, there has been next to no discussion about how a durable, secure exit for foreign troops is to be engineered in a way that does justice to the blood and treasure, Afghan and foreign, that has been spilled since 2001, or to the interests of Afghans and the West in the outcome. And the result is that today, our troops and Afghan civilians are in the front line of a strategy that has an end date but no clear end game. My contention is that the 2014 end date will prove to be a dangerous and damaging chimera unless there is an end game. And that end game must be negotiations involving Western powers, led by the US, with all factions in the Afghan struggle. And this case is based on a very simple proposition. No other approach will work. If you look at the history of the last 60 years, from Malaya to Algeria to Vietnam to Iraq, even to Northern Ireland, then it's clear why the theory and practice of counterinsurgency leads everyone to incant the cliché that there is no military solution to an insurgency. Indeed, there isn't. It is a cliché because it's true. So it is high time that we stopped behaving as if there was a military solution and developed a political one. And what I'm going to do in the lecture today is start with the current situation as I see it, then describe the political endgame that I think it's necessary for the West to spell out, and then describe a 5-point process by which that political process can be brought into being. I promise you we won't still be here at 9:30 tonight. Let me start with the current situation and talk about it in the following terms. We've been in Afghanistan for longer than the Russians in the 1980s. Our aim is clear, that Afghanistan should never again be a launching pad for terrorism by al-Qaeda. It's a noble and rightful cause. But al-Qaeda are long gone into Pakistan, where they're taking heavy punishment. The weakness, however, of the political negotiating track means that by themselves, the 4 key elements of Afghan policy for the last 10 years, first, security, second, governance, thirdly, development, and fourth, the role of the neighbouring states, cannot deliver on our core aim by the date of 2014. The lack of a political framework within which all the peoples of Afghanistan find a place means that as our military and civilian forces seek to promote security or governance or economic development, they are working with one hand tied behind their backs. In truth, it often feels like both hands are tied behind their backs. And it's really important to understand why. The issue is not simply that the political arm of the defense, development, diplomacy triad has been missing in action. There is a real misunderstanding built into that point of view. A political settlement is not one part of a multi-pronged strategy to bring the war to an end. It is a political settlement, the overarching framework within which everything else has to fit, and in the service of which everything else operates. I just want to go through the 4 areas of policy to explain why. On security, smart analysts eschew bold claims because they know that absent a political settlement, the insurgency will endure and may well grow. ISAF troop numbers are now at a little over 130,000. General Petraeus, who isn't just a smart analyst, he's one of the smartest analysts around. General Petraeus told Congress last month that the momentum achieved by the Taliban since 2005 has been arrested in much of the country and reversed in a number of areas. In other words, we're back to where we were in 2005 in some parts of the country. He set out 4 parts of the military effort: a new, higher tempo in killing or capturing Taliban leaders, the clearance of insurgents from areas in Helmand and Kandahar, the interdiction of the flow of weapons and fighters from Pakistan, and as he put it, quote, arguably the most critical element, the development of Afghan security forces. The goal is transition to Afghan security leadership by 2014, starting with 7 provinces covering 25% of the country, including Mazar-e-Sharif, where the UN suffered grievous loss of life on the 1st of April this year. Now, the numbers in the Afghan army are impressive. The latest figures are 150,000, but so are the problems. In November last year, the US DoD concluded that the best Afghan units have neither the capacity nor the will to operate on their own. Meanwhile, the attrition rate in the Afghan army is about 30%. In other words, every year the army has to re-recruit a third of its numbers just to stand still. And although the official figures show Pashtuns are represented in numbers roughly proportionate to their share in the population, the army's commanding officers are predominantly Tajik, and few of the army's foot soldiers come from the Pashtuns south and east. So that in key parts of the country, the Afghan army is seen as an occupying force. Now, it's true that where there are large numbers of coalition and Afghan troops, the insurgency can be suppressed. But it has an unerring tendency to reappear elsewhere. That's why ISAF records show 700 security incidents in the first week of 2011, up from 400 in the same period in 2010, and 200 in the year 2009. The Wall Street Journal reported at the end of December 2010 that UN security assessments used to inform decisions about where their staff can go showed an increase in insecurity across the country. Meanwhile, the International Committee on the Red Cross said in December 2010 that security was worse than any time in 30 years, and its update in March 2011 said there'd been a further dramatic deterioration in the subsequent 2 months. General McChrystal's goal of pacifying 40 of Afghan's nearly 400 districts by December 2010 and another 40 by the end of 2011 has been quietly dropped. Overall, ISAF estimates of Taliban numbers have been growing to at least 35,000 full-time fighters. I'm sorry to give the blizzard of statistics, but I think it's important to see the overall context. And this is how I see the overall context. There's a difference between tactical progress and strategic effect. Because there's a fundamental reason why progress is, quote, fragile and reversible, as General Petraeus says it is. It's that law and order in Afghanistan have never been delivered by the forces of a central state, never mind by foreigners. This is a country where tribal structures remain strong, weapons are widely available, and insurgents can melt into the local population, into a neighbouring district, or into a neighbouring province, or even into a neighbouring country. A national security force is never going to have a monopoly of force and will not be able to police the country by 2014 absent a political settlement. The ANSF, the Afghan National Security Force, can underpin peace, but it cannot deliver it. The second plank of policy has concerned governance. The Western security effort supports Afghanistan's elected government and specifically its elected president, Hamid Karzai. President Karzai has been a fixture of the last 10 years. In that time, 12 ISAF commanders have come and gone, as have countless ambassadors and special representatives. Over-reliance on the president is built into the Afghan constitution, which is one of the most centralized in the world. To his admirers, President Karzai is a man uniquely qualified to unite the Afghan people. He has the right history, he has real charisma, he cares deeply about Afghanistan. At worst, however, he is the weakest link in the campaign, unable to do the 2 jobs that the constitution asks of him: chief executive and chairman of the country at the same time. In this version, his links to electoral fraud, corruption, cronyism, and caprice have sapped the strength of the Afghan government as well as its Western allies. To quote US Ambassador and former NATO commander Carl Eichenberry, he is, quote, an inadequate strategic partner. Now, whatever view you hold, in too many parts of the country, the reality is that the Taliban outcompete the Afghan government with their own shadow government, dispensing rough justice without the corruption of the formal structures. That's the situation on governance today. That's what makes a political settlement so important. Third plank of policy has been development, because Afghanistan remains one of the poorest countries in the world. In the early years, precious gains were made, significantly to the benefit of the Afghan people. The gains in terms of girls' education have been nothing short of outstanding, but they were outstanding within 3 or 4 years of the toppling of the Taliban. Today, the Asian Development Bank reports that 42% of the Afghan people live on less than $1.25 a day. 1 in 5 children die before their 5th birthday, and short-term aid is unevenly distributed across the country. Some 70% is spent in the 2 southern provinces of Helmand and Kandahar, which itself stokes serious tensions across the country. The minerals sector in Afghanistan is worth $1 trillion, according to a recent estimate. However, it's not delivering that today. In fact, the drugs trade delivers far more than the underdeveloped minerals sector, and bribery has been estimated at 25% of GDP. The military cannot sort this out. The fourth part of policy, conducted in much more minor key, has been to prevent the neighbours of Afghanistan, especially Pakistan, from undermining the independence and stability of the country. In this, progress has been very limited. The neighbours were excluded from the Bonn Agreement on the grounds that Afghanistan had been treated as a chessboard for too long. But everyone agrees that the neighbours are key. Pakistan has been the focus. It's believed by many to be playing all sides. In the light of uncertainty about Western intentions, that's hardly surprising. But it's also self-defeating. A Turkish regional initiative in 2009-10, an important initiative, was blocked by Pakistani refusal to allow India to attend. Without a political framework within the country, the neighbours are never going to become properly engaged outside the country. They just protect their own interests. And the result is dangerous drift for all sides. And this story, across the 4 key parts of Western policy, is the context in which to see an absolutely devastating cry from an unnamed US colonel interviewed by the New York Times in March 2011, this year. The colonel talked, quote, of the great disconnect between tactical advances, often at great human cost, and strategic stalemate. Scholars at the Department of War Studies at King's College London call it an operational strategic disconnect. Now, my contention is that the only way to overcome the disconnect is an effective political process, so-called, quote-unquote, reconciliation, that deals into the political system all the players in Afghanistan's future. Discussion, however, of a peace process has unfortunately been of recent vintage. And I say unfortunately because Anand Gopal's detailed study of the insurgency in Kandahar, conducted for the New America Foundation, shows in remarkable and compelling detail how the lack of a broad-based reconciliation process after 2001 drove former Taliban regime members who were minded to surrender and abstain from political life into Pakistan, from where they eventually relaunched the insurgency. The idea of reconciliation, a peace process, and its cousin reintegration became a significant part of the narrative in 2008 and 2009 as a new US administration came into view and as it took up the reins of office. President Obama showed his understanding of the idea in his early interventions, promising, for example, quote, a reconciliation process in every province. But serious negotiations have not been launched. The Afghan High Peace Council, established at the London Conference of 2010, is an attempt to fill the gap. But it will be hamstrung until the position of the Western powers is explained. And that's what I want to now turn to. an end game depends on clarity about our position. And that has to start from an understanding of the sort of society that Afghanistan is. I don't know how many of you have read the Pulitzer Prize-winning Ghost Wars by Steve Cole, but he quotes Peter Thompson, the US Special Envoy to the Afghan resistance to the Soviet invasion, who concluded the following in 1990. He said the only model for governing Afghanistan was, quote, the decades between 1919 and 1973, when Zahir Shah's weak but benign royal family governed from Kabul and decentralized politics prevailed in the countryside, infused with Islamic faith and dominated by tribal or clan hierarchies. The Russians concluded the same after their experience in the 1980s. Stephen Biddle and his colleagues, in an important foreign affairs essay defining success in Afghanistan, one of the few pieces of work to look at the scenarios for the future governance of Afghanistan, also come to that conclusion. As they put it, centralized democracy or centralized dictatorship are unlikely. Partition or anarchy are unacceptable, which leaves decentralized democracy or what they call internal mixed sovereignty. In other words, a regulated mix of democratic and undemocratic territories. That decentralized and or mixed sovereignty model will only be achieved by engaging all the ethnic groups, interests and fiefdoms in Afghanistan and their backers in the broader region. Now we can make a guess about what some of these groups will want. The Taliban have made it pretty clear what their agenda is. Foreign troops out, Guantanamo detainees released, scope for Sharia to be the law of the land, the removal of key individuals from the UN's 1267 list, which contains those accused of terrorist crimes. Other players in the Afghan drama also have interests they will defend. Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras will want their interests and territory respected. The warlords will want a free sway to make money. We know their positions, but we haven't set out ours. The West needs a negotiating platform that does justice to our substantive interests in the future, as well as to the legacy of our actions in the past. As Secretary Clinton set out in her Asia Society speech, the reason we're in Afghanistan militarily is non-negotiable. It's to prevent it being used as an AQ base again. So the West needs long-term security guarantees that Afghanistan will never again host al-Qaeda. I emphasize host al-Qaeda because it was the sovereign cover for AQ that made Afghanistan a dangerous place in the first place, dangerous for us. Now that will require long-term cooperation beyond the funding that currently pays some $11 billion, rising to $13 billion next year, for the Afghan security forces. Just by way of comparison, keep those figures of 11 billion and 13 billion in your head. By way of comparison, the total Afghan tax and customs take is some $1 billion a year. A status of forces agreement could be the basis for that kind of cooperation. It would be a public document regulating the terms of foreign engagement with the government of Afghanistan. It would be a negotiated document, as in the Iraqi case. It could set out how to support training. It could set out how support and training would be provided and safeguards offered. It could regulate the end, ultimately, of ISAF operations and, as the Brahimi-Pickering report suggests, pave the way for any UN troop presence in the future. However, security guarantees are not our only contribution to a successful peace negotiation. We have other interests. But we also have to recognize reality. Polling figures from Helmand and Kandahar suggest large majorities of the residents there have never even heard of 9/11. Never mind the London bombings on 7/7. It's obviously for Afghans to decide how their country is run. But the West needs explicitly to embrace the idea that all significant Afghan groups should be fully represented inside the political process. Until we do so, there'll be a vacuum at the heart of the negotiations. The Taliban are not, in my view, going to disappear. They represent a highly conservative, minority strand of Islamic thought in Afghanistan. The sooner we recognize that, the better. It's right also to insist that Afghanistan remain governed by constitutional norms and more or less democratic institutions. No one group should be allowed to dominate. That is a recipe for disaster. But that cannot mean that the current centralized constitutional setup is sacrosanct. And Afghanistan does have, in the so-called Loya Jirga process, an established way to address constitutional reform. Outsiders can only offer commentary, but the country strikes me as far better suited to a federal or parliamentary system than an executive presidential system of government. In a decentralized country, can it really make sense for the president personally to appoint all 34 provincial governors and 394 district governors? Surely not. That's what I mean about a centralized constitution in a decentralized country. Afghan politics needs to be in sync with the identities, mores, and traditions of Afghanistan's tribes. These allegiances are as, if not more, defining than Afghan nationhood. Two other issues require a Western view for negotiations properly to get going. The Constitution specifies a 2-term limit for the president of Afghanistan. That seems simple enough. But the election sagas of 2009 show the dangers of sleepwalking into constitutional terra incognita. The decision to extend the life of the first Karzai government beyond its constitutional term and install President Karzai as the head of an extended interim administration, decisions that had to be taken in the early months of the Obama administration, all but guaranteed that President Karzai would remain in office for a second term. That is not the way things should be done. President Karzai will have an important place in Afghan hearts and on the Afghan scene, in or out of office. But we should learn from President Mubarak and President Ben Ali what happens when individuals, rather than institutions, become the embodiment of our engagement with a nation. The constitutional norms need to be respected. Finally, the West also has an interest in the aspirations of the Afghan constitution to equal treatment for all of its citizens, men and women. But I also know that social norms in Afghanistan are very different from our own. And that if we stand against a political settlement on the grounds that it is not socially progressive enough, we will make the mistake of trying to force Afghans towards social change at the barrel of a gun. The Afghan communists and their Soviet backers tried that and failed. The alternative is not an abandonment of aspirations for equal rights. It is to establish as a red line that the voice of Afghan women and civil society must be heard in shaping the future of the country. Social and political change happens best when it comes from within. Now, if we set out a unified and powerful Western view on these issues, on security, the Constitution, human rights and governance, then all the other players will start to adjust their position against this benchmark. At the moment, they're setting out their position not knowing what the Western benchmark is going to be. And the business of diplomacy in those circumstances can be given a chance if there is a proper process to get negotiations going. And that is the third part of the lecture that I now want to come to. How do we get a process, a political process going? First and most important, the UN Security Council needs to appoint and empower a UN mediator to facilitate talks, with a clear mandate setting out the principles of an endgame and an open invitation to all to participate. In my view, this person, he or she, should come from the Islamic world. So it's not a job application. His job would be to canvass the views of all parties and create the confidence for and commitment to a process for serious talks about the future of Afghanistan. He should, for a start, develop the idea of a safe place outside Afghanistan, an Arabian Gulf state, Turkey, Germany, Japan, for all sides to meet and talk. This might then give way to talks within Afghanistan. With all the talk, however, of Afghanization, you might ask, why have any international involvement at all? Why not just leave it to the Afghans? The reality is that the Afghans cannot negotiate on behalf of the US about the presence of international forces. Promises made by the Afghan government to the Taliban must have visible international buy-in if they are to be credible at all. Equally, as a party to the conflict, the Afghan government cannot play the role I have envisioned for a UN mediator. Negotiations would start in conditions, secondly, of minimal trust and maximum fear on all sides of humiliation. So there need to be a series of steps by which each side can assure of their bona fides. When I've done interviews in the UK media over the last 24 hours in anticipation of this speech, people very reasonably ask, how do you know if the Taliban leadership is going to respond to a political talks process? And the answer is, we can't know until we give it a go. There are people in this room who know well that there are signs that the Taliban would respond to a political framework for talks. Equally, there are signs that they might not. We've got to give it a go. This idea, however, of confidence-building measures, a series of steps by which each side can assure each other of their bona fides, is important. We have a fair idea of what the insurgency would recognize as confidence-building measures: an end to night raids, safe passage to and from talks, prisoner releases, and to those we should add suggestions of our own: localized ceasefires, security for development projects on the model of the polio vaccination campaigns that the Taliban have supported in the past, an end to intimidation of voters at elections, a Taliban declaration of disassociation from al-Qaeda. If they want more security from night raids, from the might of Western forces, then they need to stop the roadside bombs that kill and maim our own soldiers. So that's the second element, confidence-building measures. Third, the talks need the support of clear Western civilian leadership in Kabul. Clarity of civilian command should match the clarity of military command, as part of a unified civilian military command that counterinsurgency doctrine mandates. Currently, there's the following setup: the head of a UN office responsible for coordinating the UN civilian effort, a senior NATO civilian representative, an American ambassador plus 4 other American ambassadors overseeing 1,000+ strong US civilian effort, a number of important national ambassadors, plus an American replacement for the late Richard Holbrooke as special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. That special representative being matched in 40 other capitals. All these people are seasoned and serious professionals, but all interact with President Karzai and his government, and none has the dominant convening power to bring coherence to civilian strategy in the way that Ambassador Ryan Crocker did in Baghdad when he worked in partnership with General Petraeus in Iraq. So we have to do better. The UN is the obvious place to start. It's the apex of the international system. But despite the real excellence of Staffan de Mistura and the head of the UN mission, and the unique understanding of the situation on the ground that comes from 23 offices around Afghanistan, the UN does not control the levers of power that are essential to bring coherence to the international effort. We therefore need a bit of realpolitik. The international operation is above all an American operation. So the US needs to grip not just its own efforts, but the wider international effort. As the US appoints a new ambassador this year, then this appointment needs the personality, instruction, and length of mandate to convene and cohere the disparate strands of civilian effort between now and 2014. The job description would be to be President Karzai's principal interlocutor, overcoming the problem of a revolving door of different people, politicians going through President Karzai's office, working closely with him on the endgame strategy, liaising strongly with the commander of ISAF to ensure that military strategy comes behind it, and creating the framework within which the political strength of the UN and the development strength of contributing nations can bear full fruit. Fourth part of the game plan. There needs to be a process to get the neighbors talking in a serious and structured way. President Obama recognized the importance of this at the beginning of his administration. In his speech announcing the conclusion of the Rydell Review in March 2009, he proposed the creation of a regional contact group. Its role would be to engage the indispensable partners of an Afghan settlement: Pakistan, China, Russia, India, the Central Asian republics, and Iran. Today, the 40-plus group of countries with a special representative, mirroring the late Richard Holbrooke's job, have been called the contact group. But that doesn't do the trick. It's not able to bring executive clarity to the job. The new UN envoy I've already described should be responsible for regional engagement as well as internal talks. In the first instance, these discussions with regional neighbors should be bilateral. The medium-term goal should be a council of regional stability, which oversees a compact between its neighbours and Afghanistan. Fifth, Pakistan, which deserves a lecture of its own, needs a long-term relationship with the US and the European Union based on responsibility and respect. Responsibility by them, respect from us. Pakistan cannot have privilege, but pressure alone will not get it to deliver. The situation is not just chronically bad, in my view, because of disputed borders, massive inequality, fragile democratic institutions. It is acutely inflamed, with floods, terrorism, rampant food price inflation, and most recently targeted assassinations of those who have publicly criticised the blasphemy laws, as well as the Davis case. The scholar Ahmed Rashid is surely right to say that either Pakistan needs an offer which meets some of its security concerns, or its assumptions that it needs to dominate Afghanistan for security reasons needs to be changed. Both point to an upfront agreement that the West will support its long-term security in return for its help now in protecting ours, as part of a balanced approach to the whole region. The alternative is that we end up negotiating with the Taliban and separately with Pakistan in a delayed endgame. On coming to office, President Obama told the New York Times in March 2009, at the heart of an Afghan policy is going to be a smarter Pakistan policy. And he then followed it up with two important letters to President Zardari setting out his understanding of the strategic significance of a different relationship between the US and Pakistan. The response from the government and military of Pakistan was not what it should have been. But that is a reason to retable the ideas, not retreat from them, and draw out from the Pakistanis much greater clarity about their objectives, their strategy, and their commitments. These 5 issues, from the UN Mediator onwards, do not cover everything. But unless they are done, I cannot see a political process that I've explained I think is necessary getting off the ground. The best way to set it in train would be through a new UN Security Council resolution. It would set out as its driving rationale the imperatives of a political process and how it could be made to happen, rather than as now relegating the idea of a political settlement to 2 paragraphs in a 6-page mandate. I think the timetable for this is urgent. 2 international conferences, in Kabul in the summer and in Bonn in December, currently have scant agenda or purpose. The agreement of a new approach would make them historic occasions. Let me conclude in the following way. The US Department of Defense Counterinsurgency Manual embraces as fact, quote, that political factors have primacy in counterinsurgency. The proviso is an important one. The next sentence says that at the beginning of a counterinsurgency operation, quote, military actions may appear predominant as security forces conduct operations to secure the populace and kill or capture insurgents, unquote. In my view, we are well past the time to consider our military operations preliminary. I feel the urgency of properly embracing a new political offensive because the dangers, if we don't, are clear and real. The insurgency can spread, outstripping the ability of international and Afghan forces to check its growth. After all, some 45,000 foreign troops have been needed to check the advance of the Taliban in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, and there are 32 other provinces in Afghanistan. The reports of the growth of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan in the north are evidence of the dangers. Alternatively, the warlords can strengthen their grip. The efforts of the international community have been spent trying to find an alternative to Talibanization or warlordism. But the gains at the expense of the Taliban have come at the price of increased warlord strength. Just ask the citizens of Kandahar. Or perhaps worst case, the inter-ethnic strife comes to look more and more like civil war in Afghanistan. The prospect of international departure has already heightened the incentives for those outside the Pashtun heartlands of the Taliban to strengthen their own military positions and preparations. Worst of all, without a political process, we get caught in the paradox of military engagement that I saw for myself in government. When things go well, there's a case for more troops to back a winning strategy. And when they go badly, there's a case for more troops to turn them round. In one of my first conversations with the late Richard Holbrooke, he talked about the trend that he saw established at the end of the Bush administration. He called it, quote, the militarization of diplomacy. It's a very powerful phrase. That militarization of diplomacy is the product of motivation, not malice. Patriotism, not departmentalism. But it's not sensible. Richard Holbrooke was unstinting in his admiration for the bravery, can-do, and intelligence of the US military. But he also knew that its weakness was not knowing its own limits. It's good that military commanders study sociology as well as topography in the countries to which they are deployed. But it's not a substitute for the diplomatic statecraft on which peace settlements are ultimately based. Richard Holbrooke knew from his experience from Vietnam to the Balkans that insurgencies and civil wars are never ended by force. There needs to be talking and not just fighting, and sometimes the talking needs to take place while the fighting is going on. That is the way forward in Afghanistan. Mending it, not just ending it. Thank you very much indeed.
So we have some time for questions and answers. I ask that you would come to the microphone, please identify yourselves, and I'll let David alternate between the two mics and recognize the question.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Leon. I'm an undergraduate at MIT. I have a few questions. First, you mentioned about the war loss problem in Afghanistan, and we understand that the huge problem with the war is that drugs flow freely in the areas that are controlled by them, and they are a problem in the Afghan political system. How do you propose the West deal with them in a way that, in a non-military way, so that we won't expand more forces in fighting against them? Second issue is we have observed recently that there has been a decline in political will in both the US, France, and the UK in terms of maintaining our forces in Afghanistan. How do you think it will play out in the future when there's diminished political will to have our soldiers there? The last question is, how do you differentiate the moderate Taliban from the extremist Taliban when you are trying to deal with them? Thank you.
Let me start at the end. Do you want me to take these questions one by one or in groups? Let's have a few, and then let's see what themes emerge.
David, Kenway from Political Science and Engineering Systems. First, let me applaud you for trying to lay out a positive vision of an endgame, of a negotiated political solution to a very difficult set of problems. And at the same time, I'm going to ask a couple questions which focus on potential impediments or roadblocks to accomplishing what you seek to accomplish. First, in order to have a negotiated agreement, you have to have parties with some control over the constituencies that they ostensibly represent. You mentioned the Karzai government and its centralized constitution, but it is often observed that the Karzai government is a kleptocratic regime with limited control beyond those that are immediate elements or components of government. So one set of issues would really focus on the extent to which the Karzai government could enter into binding commitments and deliver, given their own weakness. The second component really focuses on incentives rather than control. In effect, whenever one talks about negotiations and outcomes, the question of what happens in the absence of success, what is the no agreement point, what are the sources of leverage to bring parties together, always exists. And the point of that comment is that looking ahead 3-4 years, in the absence of success in negotiations, where do you think the Taliban would believe that they would stand? Where do you believe the warlords would believe they stand? Or we could work through the different ethnic groups as well. But what incentives exist for parties to agree, or would simply sitting back and playing out the hand of allowing events to deteriorate and collapse serve the interests of these actors? Thank you.
You were nodding at parts of his questions. Is your question similar?
Actually, yes.
Yeah, why don't you fire away as well?
Oh, that's quite all right. My name is Mark Judge. I'm from Boston. Nice to meet you. And first of all, I want to just preface my remarks by saying that I think your attainments as Foreign Secretary were outstanding. Mm-hmm. I hope that in the future that we will be hearing more from you on the international stage.
Thank you very much.
And my question basically related in a very similar vein to the previous gentleman's question regarding the capacity of Mr. Karzai to deliver, in effect. Basically, I've heard that he's essentially the president of Kabul, and his scope, his reach is rather limited, and he has a reputation for corruption, as he and his family. And obviously, we've had some difficulty using him as an interlocutor. Wondering whether or not he needs to essentially to realize your vision of a decentralized internal political dialogue as the pathway to a meaningful permanent settlement. Wouldn't he have to give indications of being willing to voluntarily relinquish the scope of power that he currently has under the current Constitution and accept the notion of a more decentralized approach where his powers, his authority, at least which is nominally very substantial, would be more reflective of your vision of what the head of state of Afghanistan should be undertaking? Thank you.
Well, let me just take those, and then I'll come to you. So, I mean, President Karzai knows Afghanistan many, many times better than me or others in this room, and I think he knows the decentralized nature of the polity that he's dealing with. People sometimes say he's the president of the presidential palace, but he's connected by his mobile phone all around the country to a series of players, some elected, some not, some in business, some in politics. And maybe in the phrase a political settlement, I should always say, or series of political settlements. Because the truth is, I always remind people, 40,000 villages and valleys in Afghanistan. And the balance of power is not going to be a single balance of power. There will be a national balance of power in which no group is able to predominate. But there'll then be a series of local compromises. And the truth is, this isn't a country that's going to be susceptible to the sort of Dayton-style lockdown to sort it all out. It's going to be a negotiated set of compromises over a very long period that has already taken place in some parts of the country, the West notably, and will take much longer in other parts of the country. And in a way, that speaks to all three questions. Ken is right to raise the question, where's he gone? Yeah, of incentives. I mean, remember that the Taliban have been forced out of their own country. The big incentive for them is to get back into their own country. And there are some indications that Pakistan is less hospitable than it might have been. There's obviously an issue which was raised. I don't like talking about moderate versus extremist. I think that, where was the young man who asked about that? Yeah, sir. You used to talk about moderate Taliban, and I think I've learned that one's got to be careful, because when one talks, this happens in a Middle Eastern context as well, one can easily slip into suggesting that somehow these people are moderate in their degree of piety, when in fact what you think you're saying is that they don't believe in using violence to achieve their ends. And I think that I found that the moderate versus extremist tag doesn't get us very far. Your fundamental point is an important one, is to distinguish between those who are reconcilable and those who are not, would be the way I would put it. Reconcilable to a decentralized Afghan polity that allows them reasonable sway for the way they want to live their lives, but doesn't allow them to host al-Qaeda that can threaten the rest of us in crude terms. Now, I think the truth is that al-Qaeda has become more of a problem for the Taliban than it was, and they can see the danger from their association. But at the moment, they don't have an outlet back into their own country. Some will be ideologically committed to jihad, and we know that from interviews and other means. But David Petraeus himself said that at least 80% of them are not ideologically committed, And I think that if a decentralized settlement was established in Afghanistan, the incentive of coming back into their own country would be quite a strong one. The question of what degree of control is exercised is obviously one that is relevant to the state structure that President Karzai commands, but it's also one that applies within the insurgency. And one of the worrying aspects at the moment is that the one unintended consequence of the hits that are being taken by the insurgency is it becomes that much more fragmented and that much more uncontrolled. And its leaders, for obvious reasons, fear making connection with their followers, which has military gains but may have political downsides. And that's why I emphasize the importance of creating some kind of safe space where people can actually talk. Because without that, it's very hard to see a series of political settlements being taken forward. Let me just make one other point. We mustn't overestimate our own influence on this outcome. This is going to be an Afghan outcome, and it's a hoary old cliche to say that we have watches but the insurgency has time. But it's a hoary old cliche because it's true. And Ken implied that they could just wait us out. Now, my own instinct is that while the tolerance of Western publics for an endless war on the current scale is limited, I don't think that the memory of 9/11 will fade so fast as to make it impossible for Western powers, notably the US, to have some kind of security presence. They're what would be called a counter-terrorist rather than a counter-insurgent approach. My own feeling, though, is that when counterinsurgency is unsuccessful, it makes counter-terrorism that much more difficult to perform. And that's why I think it's right to conceive this as a counter-insurgency mission, but it's one that cannot work without a political framework to bring the war to an end. Final point about the dangers of warlordism. We can't overestimate our power in that respect either. However, the illegal economy in part thrives because the legal economy is so stunted, both by lack of infrastructure as well as by lack of security. And I think that the economic dimension to Afghanistan's future shouldn't be underestimated. It's not an accident that the Chinese have invested $3 billion in the mineral sector of the future. And this was an extremely wealthy crossroads at various points in its history, and it could become so again. So.
Hello, I'm Thomas. I'm a graduate student at Harvard. So now that you've said what should happen, what do you think will happen? What do you think the situation will be in 2014? I know this is sort of asking you to read tea leaves, but I'd just like to see your opinion.
I'm Corey. I'm an undergraduate in economics here at MIT. I think the previous discussion has kind of outlined maybe why a political settlement is so difficult. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about our options if a political settlement fails, if we really can't achieve anything there.
So my name is Faisal Hassan, and I represent a very small department here at MIT. I doubt you ever took courses in it. It's the History of Art and Architecture program at MIT.
I wish I'd taken courses in it.
I'm
I'd be a
working
far
on
more cultured person if I had.
I'm working on my PhD right now in American art and architecture post-World War II. The question I have for you it relates to art and culture, actually, and it comes from an anecdote which is very close to my heart. My grandparents, who were South Asian from India and from Pakistan, served in the British Army during World War II. And one of the anecdotes that was shared at the time had to do with the Arts Council of England and how people were lining up for bread, and the Arts Council of England was still giving grants to artists. And this was, very surprising to people, and people were outraged. And what Winston Churchill responded was, "Well, what do you think we're fighting the war for?" So with that as sort of the background, I'm curious how much policy engages with issues of culture, aesthetic, and artistic production. It seems to me when we produce scholarship in our department, we do engage heavily with issues of politics. when we do history of art and architecture. But I don't see it happening from the other direction as much. I see that there are events, even at the Asia Society, that obviously have to do with culture. But it's only at very critical moments. Bamiyan and the Buddhas was an instance, for instance, in Afghanistan, made a presence on the arts section of the newspapers. In my grandparents' time, it would have been the building of New Delhi that became a big deal. In one case, it was conflict. In the other case, it was government. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what role you see the arts and culture playing in resolving or addressing this conflict as indicators, possibly.
Interesting. Is your question connected to that, or shall I?
No, it's completely different.
Right, okay. Thought I might be able to play for time a bit by getting you to ask your question. What will happen if, in the absence of a political process, I set out 3 or 4 dark scenarios: interethnic strife, growth of warlordism, growth of the insurgency. And I think that the closer we get to 2014, the greater the impatience in our own countries, and the greater the danger that our own leverage is weakened. The central case, where is Thomas? Yeah, the central case is not for a neat outcome, I think would be the most diplomatic way I would put it. And I think that we have to keep in mind our 2 interests. It's really important, this, and I tried to say this in my lecture. There is a substantive security interest, and there is our interest in the narrative that concludes our engagement, or that marks the next stage in our engagement, because the truth is, on a development basis, we're going to have to be engaged there, even if much less on a military basis. And we have to protect both the substantive and the narrative aspects. And that's why I think that a political process, in the end, will bring this to a conclusion. The question is whether we have a agenda-setting role in it or not. And the options, if we fail, I think I've sort of covered that in that answer. Now, in terms of the sort of left field point, and I mean, the answer must be it's not given sufficient sort of recognition. And I don't say that in a flip way, actually, because I think that both amongst the military and among diplomats, the dedication to try to understand the culture into which one was moving, that I saw notably on the British side, but I spent more time with them, but also with American and other side, is real. And that includes culture broadly defined. Included language, skills that were worked on quite hard. Art, in the narrow sense, I wouldn't want to make great claims for, although there are NGOs, some of them who've become well known, who have worked hard on that. And it is a crying shame when you remember what Kabul was or not remember, but read about what Kabul was in the 1970s. I mean, it was the crossroads of the hippie trail. It was a centre of art, and some people here may even have been on it. Not that I'm looking at anyone in particular, but those cultural roots are real. And Kabul is not Mazar-e Sharif, and it's not Lashkar, but the distinctive local cultures and identities are going to be central to this, because they were there before the British first went there in the 19th century, and they're going to be there long after we've gone. I'd say one other thing is that there's a danger that one looks for iconic cultural projects, and I think that is a danger, because the truth is iconic projects should emerge from within, not be imposed from without. And so I've always been quite wary that we should be deciding what is a great Afghan cultural project. We should be trying to create the space where that can develop. Now, the fact that in the 90s Taliban banned music, I mean, that it gives you some idea of, and the hatred of them is obviously for fundamental reasons to do with the abuse of rights, but it's also to do with what kind of place Afghanistan had become by the end of the 90s. So I hope that gives some justice to the importance of the question that you asked.
My name is Bernard. I'm a student at the School of Oriental African Studies in London. And I wanted to ask, would you agree that the drone strategy being pursued by this administration in Pakistan is counterproductive? Because by killing civilians, and often the Taliban exploit this very strategy by planting false intelligence at weddings and things like that to fuel a cycle of violence, and that it's also illegitimate. I'd quite like to talk about the impact that civilian casualties has on the legitimacy of Hamid Karzai's government as well. And we've had recent air attacks that he's condemned, and this seems to show he doesn't actually have any control, and he's simply a puppet with the strings being pulled in Washington. And finally, in terms of historical precedents, it seems that history is not really talked about in Afghanistan, because I think it's especially British history, because perhaps if somebody goes on Wikipedia in 40 years' time, this will be called the Fourth Afghan War. And we've been here before, as it were. And in relation to drone strikes on the northwest frontier, the way that the British, in the days of imperialism, used to police that area through long experience, was not one of just kind of repression, as it were, but more negotiating with local forces and using the kind of strategies that you outlined here, more than simply pressing a button and hoping this will fix things.
Mm-hmm. Sir.
Hi, my name is Andrea Lamariu. I work here in MIT, in MTL. Excuse my English. I have and the question too. So if you look at the world right now, the whole most important hot points are where the British Empire was and retired. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Cyprus, Israel, you name it, Rwanda. So the question is...
I have a feeling I know where this question's going.
Yeah. The question is, it might look like a coffee talk, but you have been involved directly deep in the British politics. That was by design or by a lack of vision? And if the British government and British people are feeling responsible somehow for this?
Okay. Sir.
Mr. Miliband, thank you for coming. My name is Arun. I'm a student at Northeastern University. I actually had the chance to intern at the UK Parliament last year through the Hansard program for Lord Soley, the House of Lords. Lord Soley was a pretty strong defender of interventionary efforts during the last decade. Do you think the events of the previous decade overall have made British policymakers wary of future intervention efforts? That's basically it.
Okay, let me just run through those, and then we can let people... Oh, sorry. Terribly's right.
That's good. I'm Layla Wahidi. I'm a master's student with political science. So I agree. I think that negotiations are very important. The one thing that I would ask is, who exactly are we going to negotiate with? It seems like we spent 10 years trying to centralize. We've taken out, in an attempt to remove warlordism, we've taken out the warlords that have regional support in some areas. The Taliban is more fractionized. So who do you foresee us actually negotiating with that is going to be able to control power, or to have enough power to control their regions?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Let me start with Bernard's question. I mean, the civilian casualty, where is he? Yeah. The civilian casualties issue is a real issue, and it's caused enormous damage to the trust in our project. You're right that the Taliban misuse civilian casualties. It's also the case that the latest UN figures show that 75% of civilian casualties are caused by the insurgency. not by the Western forces. However, 9 children got killed in a misbegotten Western airstrike. That does monumental damage. And you talk to any of the military commanders, and they know that. General McChrystal made this the absolute centerpiece of his drive alongside population protection, General Petraeus as well. But it's very, very hard to persuade a father or mother who's lost their child that you're there to protect them, if in fact they've died at your hands. I think drone strikes is a different issue. Drone strikes is an issue on the Pakistan side of the border. Sorry? Yeah, but to be fair, the drone strikes are aimed at Al-Qaeda, not at Taliban. I mean, it's not really an effective... I don't think anyone believes it's the effective way to end the war. And we were having an off-the-record discussion earlier at a seminar at the Centre for International Studies where we got into this drone strikes thing in rather more detail than I will in this public forum. I think that the truth is it plays both ways. It achieves real military gains. There's absolutely no question about it. The pounding that the AQ leadership has taken has taken a real toll. Equally, it can be used or misused to fuel a sense that this is not Pakistan's war, it's somebody else's war. And it plays both ways, I think, is the fairest answer for that. I'll come back to the second and third questions in a minute. I mean, Lalo asked, who do you negotiate with? Afghanistan's tribal structures, despite the... Where are you? Yeah. Despite the ravages of 30 years of civil war, the tribal structures remain strong, I think, stronger than one might imagine. There are both tribal leaders and elected representatives, and then there are insurgent representatives. Now, you shouldn't be able to bomb your way to the negotiating table, but equally, those who command people or guns command attention. And so I would advocate a rather open approach to who can participate in negotiations. And what I said about maintaining democratic norms tries to establish formal systems of accountability alongside the informal systems that continue to exist and, in my view, will exist for another century in Afghanistan. So I would advocate a rather open approach. On, the question of whether it's all Britain, whether it's all our fault. I mean, the truth in this area is some things were done in a way that bred later problems, and other things were done in an extraordinary, in parts of the world, decolonization was an extraordinarily successful and peaceful process. And there are mixed models. Now, one of my predecessors appointed Sir Henry Durand to draw the Durand Line, which is the 2,500-kilometre border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's still contested today, and it's rather sobering when you sit in the Foreign Secretary's office in King Charles Street, because it's from that office that the command went to draw the Durand line. I think that carries with it a weight of history. I think it should carry a degree of humility, but I don't think it should carry a sort of an overriding guilt, because I think that is to occlude the fact that there are many sides to the story of the British Empire, a story that brought extraordinary gains and a story that had with it some appalling tragedies. You know, some of the one tragedy, and not just a tragedy, one worse than tragedy, is going through the British courts in respect of Kenya at the moment and the Mau Mau. So you should have humility, but not end up in a position of being talked out by guilt. And that relates to the last question. I think that the events of the last 10 years have been extremely sobering for people who believe there are international responsibilities that strong powers should have, whether they be to protect human rights or to stand up for the rule of law. And I think that in all Western countries there is a sobriety and a humility about interventionism, which will condition all future governments. Now, as we see in the Libyan case, that doesn't mean that where there is a clear and present danger to large numbers of civilians and a credible military plan to do something about it, there'll be a block on action. There hasn't been, in my view, rightly. But the tests, which should be clear and include whether or not military action it should always be a last resort, and whether or not it's the last resort has been reached, whether there's a credible plan. All those tests have to be met. And I think that if there's one thing more clear than anything else, it's that often winning wars is the easy part, and building peace is much more difficult. And that seems to me to be a very powerful lesson, both of the Afghan experience and of the Iraqi experience. Now, I've seen two people who wanted to ask questions, so should we have two more? Last two. Ladies first, I think.
Thank you so much for your talk today. My name is Cressida Pollock. I'm at MIT Sloan doing an MBA. You mentioned that there are different social norms in Afghanistan. And I wanted to ask you, is there a level of social norm that you're willing to negotiate to? I mean, is there a point that you don't accept, especially considering sort of some of the things that went on before the invasion? Thank you.
Steve.
I'm Steve Enever. I teach international relations in the MIT Political Science Department. I wanted to ask you to talk about what the lessons of history are for the project you are recommending. What are the lessons of past efforts for outside powers to resolve conflicts of this kind, and what are the sort of models that emerge from history for resolving a conflict like this? I was sort of sketching here some of the more recent efforts that are similar in that an outside power was trying to steer a situation like Afghanistan to a soft landing. We have the Kenya conflict of 2008, which was handled very well by Kofi Annan and others who mediated sort of a power-sharing arrangement. We have the British effort to bring Rhodesia/Zimbabwe to a soft landing 30 years ago, which succeeded in the short run and failed in the long run, if you will. We have Bosnia, where the U.S., after stumbling around for a long time, finally brought the Bosnia conflict to an end in 95. We have Northern Ireland, where the U.S. played a tiny role there. It was mainly an internal matter, but it was a civil war settlement that may have interesting lessons. There's the whole Iraq matter, which, in my view, the U.S. has bungled its efforts to bring internal politics in Iraq to a soft landing. Things now look like they're better than they were, but they don't look very solid. We have El Salvador, which was settled back in the 90s in part by outside powers steering it to a kind of a one-sided compromise. So what do you think are the lessons of these efforts? And if you're looking for a model, sort of like what other effort are you recommending we now try to undertake in Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very tough questions to end with. I mean, is it Christina? Kressner. I mean, what social norms would I not negotiate down to? And that's hard because you're talking about other people's futures. But I'd answer it through the following example. Something called the family law was proposed in Afghanistan by the Afghan parliament in 2009, I think. And there was an enormous international outcry about it because it grossly violated the rights of women that clearly were below the norm that one would want. And I raised that case for a rather sobering reason. And that is that, in my view, it was completely right to make a great song and dance about it. But as I and others made that song and dance, I knew that the passage or not of the family law would make relatively little difference in a lot of parts of Afghanistan that were going to carry on merrily, whatever the law said. And I think that makes this area very, very difficult, because what you are negotiating de jure is not necessarily what is going to happen de facto. And so that's why I tried to choose my words carefully in my lecture, that you cannot force social progress at the barrel of a gun. And you can't allow, you can work hard to get the right things written on paper, but you shouldn't kid yourself that by doing so you've thereby made the lives of people better. You've maybe given them a chance to sue for their lives to be better. Sue, not I don't mean literally litigate, but you've given them a political platform, and that's why I talked about institutionalizing political voice for groups who need it. But I hope that I didn't want in any sense to suggest a sort of flipness about that, but I think one has to be very, very conscious that one can pretend one is a life maker for people when in fact one isn't. I mean, the lessons of history, I should have answered that actually, because was it Bernard or someone earlier? Yeah, Bernard, you asked about the lessons of history. If you read my speech from last year, there's quite an extensive section on the historical period. I didn't want to repeat it. And in a way, the place to start, Steve, where are you? Yeah, is Afghan history. Because one can't both say that this is a distinctive culture with a distinctive history, and then say, by the way, Northern Ireland is going to be the model. I've always strongly, strongly resisted the temptation to import a parallel from so far away. And so I think that's why I chose the quote about the decentralized rule from 1919 to 1973, Zahir, before the last king, because there are parallels between the way some of the mistakes that we've made in the last 10 years and the way the British governed in the 19th century, and there are also some parallels in what I've been saying for the way you can govern effectively. And, I mean, the British used a system of maliks for a long time, which were essentially paid agents to run the place. That's not what I'm recommending here. I'm talking about creating a process by which we hold the ring. And we hold a ring in a way that legitimately asserts that in an interdependent world we can have interests without trying to over-engineer the solution. Now, I referred to Dayton earlier, and I think that the contrast is pretty striking, because for all the difficulties that exist in Bosnia today, there is a single settlement. There's not going to be a single settlement in Afghanistan. If there is a national agreement, it's going to pave the way for a series of local agreements. And so I'm nervous of picking the obvious peacemaking cases that have brought a national solution. I don't know enough about the El Salvador case, but even the Iraqi case feels to me, whenever I was Foreign Secretary, I always tried to stop speeches putting Iraq and Afghanistan in the same paragraph, just because or even the same page, just because they were happening in the same decade. It didn't mean that there was an easy transfer of them. Zimbabwe, I don't like to use that either, because in a way that was a decolonization, and we are not engaged in a colonizing project in Afghanistan. Now, one interesting question is, how was Afghanistan run after the Russians left? Because after they left militarily, they put a lot of money in for 3 years. And Afghanistan was run on a pretty decentralized basis, but with Soviet subsidy. And the subsidy was ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, they came to the same conclusion as the 1990 special representative of the US. And so I would want, I think there's a richness of historical lessons within the Afghan experience that I think is our best guide to the pitfalls and dangers, but also to some of the potentialities there. And the final point I'd make is this. The internal and the external are in other words, the internal and the regional are inextricably linked in Afghanistan in a way that I think is different from pretty much each of the other cases that you've mentioned. I can't think that in each of the other cases you've got the same interplay of domestic actors and regional actors. And that's why I think that the internal settlement And who do you negotiate? I should have said this in respect to an earlier answer. Who do you negotiate with is a difficult question internally. It's not actually a difficult question regionally. We know who the countries are. And they need to be engaged. And the former ambassador in Kabul, who I work very closely with, Sherard Cooper-Coles, talked about a double-decker bus. It's a very British way of thinking about it. But he talked about the internal parties on the lower deck and the external parties on the upper deck, and a UN driver with American gasoline. And that is maybe one sort of bright metaphor through which to bring that idea of an internal and external settlement to light. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much.